this like calculate activity. About half attempted it, and I looked through the submissions, and a lot of the code was actually pretty good. But basically, the task was to try to create a calculator and to include variables, if, else if, and else statements, print statements, and bonus like an input. And there weren't like too many instructions, so it was kind of very fluid. And so here's kind of like an example code of a program that does work. So first, really quickly, the slash n, the backslash n, or forward slash, the slash n that you see here, this is a new line character. Oops, this should be slash. So what it does is it like creates a new line, like indents a whole new line, and it's just to make the format a bit better. But basically, it first asks for an input, and it prints out the statement choose operation, 1 addition, 2 subtraction, 3 multiplication, 4 division, and then it takes an integer. So the idea is the user types in 1, 2, 3, or 4, signifying either plus, minus, multiply, or divide. And then it takes in 2 more integer inputs, enter the first integer and enter the second integer. So those are the 2 numbers that we're going to be adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing. Then it uses the if else statements, and it checks if the operation, right, the variable which we stored 1, 2, 3, or 4, it checks if it's equal to 1, then we add them. If it's 2, subtract 3, 4, so on. And there's also one else statement. So if the user types in like 0 or like 5 or something that's not 1, 2, 3, 4, then it'll print out operation invalid. Please choose an integer between 1 to 4. And it's just kind of like a fail safe, right? Because we don't want the user to choose 0 or 5 or anything else than 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you were to run the code, you'll see that this is the first print statement, the input, and you'll notice the slash n here, it creates a new line. So there's a new line, then there's 3 spaces to indent it, then another new line, 3 more spaces, and it's just a little like formatting. So then you can choose like multiplication, 3, then enter first integer. The slash n here is another new line, so we can choose like 5, second integer, 7, and it'll print out 35. And if we were to try it again, but this time, like let's say we put in like 7 for the operation, which shouldn't be legal, it'll still ask for the first 2 integers, and we can enter 5 and 7 again. But then you'll notice it says operation invalid. Please choose an integer between 1 to 4. And so that's kind of an example code of the calculator activity. And it's posted on GitHub, and we'll post it later. We'll email it out later as well. But moving on for today, today's probably going to be one of the last lesson we have on the like Python. Starting next time we meet in 2 weeks, we're going to shift to some more different topics. We'll announce those a bit later. But we're going to quickly go over loops. So for loops and while loops. So in programming, you can use a loop to iterate or over like a sequence or whatever you want. And there are 2 types of loops. So we'll first start with for loops. And for loops are useful if you know how many iterations you have. So an iteration is basically like one cycle within a loop. So let's say you know for a fact that I want to cycle 5 times like around this track, then you would probably use a for loop because you know how many times you want to iterate. And the format for a for loop is for, then you have your your like condition. So we can do for I in range 5, and I'll explain what that means in a second. And then colon, kind of like an if statement, it has a colon at the end, and then whatever you want it to do during the cycle. So let's say during the cycle we want to print what I is, and so I'm going to quickly run it first to show the output. So you see it shows 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So essentially what these 2 lines did was it created a variable called I, a temporary variable, and I starts at 0. and it cycles from I in range of 5, and range 5 means from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, as we can see here. Basically, starting from 0, all numbers up to 5, but not including 5. And then each time we printed out I. So it prints out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We could change what to print. So for example, um, we could print out like a statement, like test instead. And you'll see this time, instead, it just prints out the word test 5 times. And so that's kind of like a for loop. And it's pretty useful because let's say, for example, you want to sum up the numbers like from 1 to 100, like 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. And even if you have a calculator, it's going to take some time because you have to manually add every single number, unless you know some shortcuts in math, of course. But with a for loop, we could, for example, um, we could create a variable. Let's call it sum, and we'll initialize it to 0 at first. And then we create a for loop. And this time, instead of I, we'll call it counter. So this is a temporary variable. It's called counter. And it's just going to increment or increase by 1 every time. Um, and we're going to go in the range. But this time, instead of putting range 100, because we know range 100 goes from 0 to 99, right? Because if range 5 goes from 0 to 4, then range 100 must go from 0 to 99. So we can actually change it to 1, comma 101. And so now what we're saying is start at the number 1, but end before 101. So now it'll go from the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to 99 and 100, which is what we want. And then colon. And this time, instead, we could still print out counter. And let's see what happens first. So it prints out the numbers starting from 1 to 99 or to 100. And so I'll comment that out. And what we could do is we could do sum is equal to sum plus counter. And so what I'm doing here is I'm taking whatever value sum is and adding the counter to it. So if sum is 0 and counter is 1, then sum becomes 1. And if sum is 1 and counter is 2, then sum becomes 3, right? Because sum is equal to 1 plus 2, which is 3. And so I'll print out sum every time, and we'll see what's in the variable. And so you see it starts from 1 to 3 to 6 to 10, right? Because 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 3 is 6, 6 plus 4 is 10, plus 5 is 15, and so on. And then you see that the last number is 50, 50, which is correct. That is the sum of the numbers 1 to 100. And so you can do that pretty quickly with just a simple for loop. And you can like print out sum at the end, so it's a bit cleaner. So it's just one line over there. And so that's kind of what a for loop does. If you have any questions, you can ask now. And one last thing I want to show for loop is you can actually loop through the characters in a string, which is pretty handy. So for example, let's say you have a string and inside you have hello, right? And you want to print out every single letter within the string. Currently, we don't really know how to do that. I mean, you might know how to do it, but it's not like very simple for us to print out every single letter, not like numbers, because strings are immutable and we can't exactly like subtract or divide with a string. What we can do is we can iterate or cycle over the string and over every single letter. It's actually kind of like built in, so we can do the same thing for temporary variable. We'll call it char. You can call it whatever you want, char. In string colon and then print char. Oops. So what we're doing here is we're looping over every single letter inside the string hello, and we're printing out every single letter. So you see it prints out HELLO. And that's pretty useful. As you can imagine, you can do like a lot more things with like something as simple as this. And then there's also another type of loop. It's called the while loop. And this one is useful if you are unsure about how many iterations. So the analogy I used last year was like, if you imagine like you're running, like you're doing like a mile run, that would be like a for loop because mile run, right? Your PE teacher tells you, hey, you have to run 5 times around the field or however many times, right? And so you know how many times you want to loop or cycle. But a while loop, you can think of it like kind of like the pacer test, right? uh, I assume y'all studied pacer tests, where like you kind of go until failure, until you decide to quit. And so you don't know how many iterations, you don't know how many times you're going to like ultimately run. You just know you're going to keep on running until you get tired, or the teacher like tells you to stop. And so that's when you would use a while loop, when you're unsure about how many times you want to cycle through something, but instead you know you want to keep on doing this task until a condition becomes true. And that's also the format of a while loop. You do while, so similar to for, you put while in the beginning, and in this time, you want to put a condition here. You want to put a condition here and then colon. So our condition is basically a Boolean statement. So for example, if I were to put while one is equal to one, now we know this is true, right? Because one is one. So it should be an infinite loop. Uh, it's gonna break. Okay, yeah. So you see it's an infinite loop, right? It prints out one like a million times because this expression here is true constantly. And if I were to just replace it with the Boolean state, like the Boolean value of true, then the same thing will happen. And I'll just print out one a million times or like indefinitely. But we can do something like create a variable. Let's create a variable called var, or we'll call it num, and we'll give it the value of 0. Then while num is less than 5, we'll print out num. And then we can try it again. And you'll notice it doesn't exactly work. What happens is it still prints out 0 like a million times. And the reason is because we never updated the value of num. Because while you're running the loop, what the computer sees is it understands that num has been given the value of 0. And then it compares, is 0 less than 5? 0 is less than 5, so it's true. So it then prints out num, which is 0. Then it goes again and it compares the value of num to 5. And since num didn't change, the value didn't change, and the Boolean is still true, so it just keeps on printing. But what we can do is we could do num plus equal 1. Plus equal is the same way as num is equal to num plus. So this part right here, num is equal to num plus 1, is the same thing as num plus equal 1. And so this just increments the value of num by 1. And so this time you'll see it prints out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'll just comment all of this out just for now. So you see it prints out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so you see for this one, the for loop is a bit better because it's only 2 lines of code, right? And our while loop is 4 lines of code. And that's because for iterating from the range of numbers 0 to 5, we know how many times we want to iterate, which is 5 times, which is why for loop is a bit better. Obviously, there's still times where while loops may be better, even though you know how many times you want to cycle. But normally, rule of hand is if you don't know how many times you want to iterate, you should use a while loop. And if you do know how many times you want to iterate, you should use a for loop. And so some other things we could do for while loop, let's say we want to do the sum from 0 to 100. I'm sorry, 1 to 100 again. So we could do sum is equal to 0. We're going to have to create a counter started at 1. And then while this counter is less than or equal to 100, right? Because we want to go to 100, then we should do the same thing, sum plus equal counter, right? Which is similar to this line here, sum is equal to sum plus counter. Sum is plus equal counter. Then we need to update the value of counter. So counter plus equal 1. And then at the end, we can print out sum. And you should see, hopefully, that it prints out 50-50, which is the same answer. And so that's how like you would kind of use a while loop. And then if you wanted to use a while loop for the string to like do the same thing that we did here, it's actually much more trickier and it's not as straightforward. I could, I'll just quickly show like how you would do it, but it involves some more advanced topics. But essentially, what you would do is you create a counter equals 0, and this counter we're going to iterate from each index of the string. So in our string string equals hello. Index 0 is H, index 1 is E, index 2 is L, index 3 is L, index 4 is O. And the reason why the index starts at 0 is because Python is a zero-based programming language. It's kind of complicated why it's zero-based, but just know a lot of common programming languages start from 0 when counting, and you can like Google and like learn about the reasoning why, but just most of the time, just remember it starts at 0. And what we do with the while loop is we do the same thing while counter is less than, and we want to go less than the length of this string. So we can do the length function, len. This is a function, whatever you put inside, it will output the integer of the length of it. So just really quickly, if I were to print len parentheses string, it should give me 5 because there are 5 characters and the length of the string is 5. So while the counter is less than 5, or length of string, we actually want to print string brackets counter. And so this is like the new part that we haven't really learned. What this is here is we're actually treating the string more like an array, which is like a list. You can think of it as a list. And so right here, what we're doing is we're doing string of index 0, string of index 1, index 2, index 3, index 4, and then we're incrementing counter. And you'll see it still works. Hello. If you don't understand this part, it's okay. Don't worry about it. We might get into it a bit later. And I'm sure if you continue learning computer science, you'll understand it in the near future. And so that's pretty much it for loops and while loops. If anyone has any questions, now is the time. And last thing I wanted to go over is the calculated activity that we did from last week that we just showed right here, right? I actually want to kind of, we should improve on it because we now know how to use loops, right? Okay, so this is what we currently had. Oh, oops. Okay, so this is the code we had. I could run it. You can see it's the same thing. We can do addition. 2 plus 4 is 6. And so the thing is, if we put in a wrong operation, if we put in 99 and we put Su5, it says operation invalid, right? And the program just ends here by itself. And we don't want it to end. So we can actually use loops to not have it end and to have it keep on running until they enter a valid operation. So I'm going to go through this a bit fast. Actually, it won't be that fast. But so what we want to do is we'll keep the operation. So we'll keep this variable and it's going to store whatever number they put. But what we want to do is we want to check if this number is 1, 2, 3, or 4. If it's not 1, 2, 3, or 4, we want to ask them again, hey, can you choose an operation but do it correctly this time, right? So we can do a while loop, and while the value of operation, this variable, is less than 1, or the value of the operation is greater than 4. And the or here is exactly as you think it is. It's for the Boolean expression, and it just compares if it's less than 1 or if it's greater than 4, right? And you can change this to, you can do and now we'll check if it's less than 1 and greater than 4, which is impossible. There's no number that's less than 1 and greater than 4. No, that doesn't happen. But we want or, because we want to check if there's any number that's lower than 1 or greater than 4, because if there is, then we want to print what we have here. We want to tell them, hey, your operation is invalid. And then we want to ask them one more time, can you choose a correct operation? So now if we run the code, you'll see it looks normal, choose operation. Let's say we choose 3. Nothing happens. And the reason why nothing happens is because if we check the while loop, is 3 less than 1? It's not less than 1. Is 3 greater than 4? It's not greater than 4. So this Boolean here is false. And this while loop never gets run. And it asks us for the first 2 numbers, and we can do 5 and 7 again, and it gives us 35. But if we were to put in 9, which is greater than 4, right? Is 9. Then it'll ask us, hey, operation invalid, please choose an integer between 1 to 4, and it'll ask us again. And we can try again, and we can put 8. And it'll keep on asking us until we put in a number that's 1, 2, 3, or 4. And now that we put in 1, we can now enter the first integer. 2 plus 4 is 6. And so that's kind of like an example of how we can use a while loop within the calculator activity to keep on asking for an input that's valid within our bounds, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we can later on compute what we want to compute, knowing that the number, the value of this operation variable is either 1, 2, 3, 4, which also means we can delete this statement here, the else, because there's no need for the else, seeing as we know for a fact that it will never be greater than 4 or less than 1. And so the code will still be fine. Yeah. And so I think that's pretty much it for today.